Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who've logged in, thank you for joining this webinar series on using research to inform online course design and facilitation practices. This is the 5th webinar that we are hosting in this series, and it's titled Instructor Presence at the Intersection of Social and Teaching Presence. And we have Dr. Jennifer Richardson and Dr. Adrie Koehler-Blair from Purdue University. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Florence Martin. I'm the current president of the Division of Distance Learning from AECT, and DDL is hosting the series of webinars. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Richardson and Dr. Koehler-Blair to take us through their webinar. And if you have any questions, you could feel free to post it in the chat window, and they'll have more directions for us and how they want to take the questions. Thank you so much for doing this for us, and we appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Jennifer Richardson. Adrie, I'm in Indiana. Adrie's in Virginia. We're going to do co-presenting, and this will be interesting. I think we got it under control. So what we're actually presenting on is 2 studies that went together from the same data collection, but looking at different viewpoints of instructor presence. One at what we considered instructor presence and conceptualizing it, and then one which is a very difficult one to say really fast, instructors' perceptions of instructor presence. So that's our second part. And we had some interesting findings. Since we're going to be doing kind of a combo presentation, after we present on the first one, we can take some questions if you have any or comments. And then again at the end we'll have a kind of an overall discussion, and we can go from there. So that's kind of what our plan is, but let us know if anything else comes up along the way that you want to interject. We're pretty good with that. Okay. So based on this being the DDL group, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with a lot of the background in online learning, and probably with the community of inquiry. So we're just going to kind of give you a very brief overview for those of you who might need a refresher. One of the things that really brought this to light for us, and we started this as a research project in a doctoral research course, looking at online learning, is how our own master's program has been unfolding. So we started our online master's in 2012, and since that time, I believe we currently have, God forbid, 300 people in the online masters, which is not my doing. But what goes along with that is not just the size, but then we have so many additional pieces and people that are involved, because then we have LTLs, limited term lecturers, some people call them adjuncts. And it's these people that are coming into the program, our doctoral students, that are having to find where they fit in a course that perhaps they have not created, right? So we know that online learning opportunities are continuing to grow. They're growing everywhere, not just here. But that's, that's the snapshot of what was going on in our program at the time. We also know that many instructors have little or no online teaching experience, and they aren't always necessarily certain about how to make the best use of their time, how to do things well, effectively, efficiently. These are things they come into, or they think they know, and they get there and they find out that's not really how it is. And at the same time, we also know that we have students forever have been reporting frustrations. We all know we can't please everybody. I can't find that course where you can please everybody, but some of those feelings are being disconnected from peers and instructors, understanding instructional goals. Some have a hard time with not receiving real-time feedback, not even real-time, but sometimes timely feedback. And we also know that many online instructors have insufficient guidance for how to enact their presence in online environments. And that could be a bunch of things. That could be not only learning how to be effective and efficient, but how to put themselves out there for the students to view them. What is their online persona going to be like? So figure out the best way to change my slides here. Hold on. Arrows. Got it. So we're coming from the community of inquiry framework. That's our lens that we were looking at. Many scholars have used this as a way to look at online learning environments, making them effective, efficient, and meaningful, which is the most important part for us as educators. So there are 3 constructs: social presence, teaching presence, cognitive presence. For this one, we're going to be focusing specifically on social presence and teaching presence and where they're intersecting. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here. So social presence, the degree in which participants feel connected. And as we know, I think Patrick Lowenthal's done an article. We've done one in a meta-analysis that talks about there are many different definitions of social presence, but in general, the degree in which participants feel connected or they perceive the other person in the online exchange. And that's made up of things like elements of affective expression, open communication, where we build a sense of group commitment, group cohesion, whereas teaching presence is really, for us, and these studies was about the methods that instructors use to create that online instructional experience, that course, and hopefully productive communities of inquiry. So of the behaviors, we'll see the first one is design and organization, and that's actually something that we didn't focus on specifically for this. What we focused on was the implementation phase of courses, so that's why it's kind of the intersection. So we did talk about direct instruction, we looked at facilitating discourse, and even some assessment. So to give you a better idea, for the purpose of this study, as I make all my doc students start off with, for the purpose of this study, instructor presence at the bottom is defined as the specific actions and behaviors projected or taken by the instructor to project himself as a real person, specifically socially and pedagogically. And it's very important because a lot of people only have that option. They don't have the design option as something that they can build things into necessarily. So a couple of notes about this. We used observable instructional behaviors when we did these studies and actions. We looked at the live parts of the courses. For example, here, we might have one of our courses, EDCI 513. And it might have, I think it might have like 15 sections sometimes with 15 students in it. Well, not all of those people are going to be full-time faculty. We wish, but somehow the university doesn't want to give us that many full-time faculty, so that's not going to happen. So we're looking at the live part of the courses. Okay, so we're going to switch over to the first study. Go ahead, where we conceptualized and investigated what instructor presence looks like. So the research questions were to explore this construct that we were thinking about, instructor presence, how it's conceptualized, how do the instructors incorporate instructor presence into their courses, and what are those specific actions and behaviors taken by them to form profiles of instructor presence, which Adrie will be talking about those, which are, I thought they were a really interesting aspect that we came up with for this study. Adrie?
All right, so to look at these research questions, and we used a multiple case study approach with the intent to build both an explanation of instructor presence and, like Jennifer said, specific profiles to really kind of get a feel for what was going on and how different instructors were creating presence. And we did this through a cross-case synthesis. So again, this was research that we did in our online master's program, and we looked at instructors' communication interactions and their actions that were within the learning management system. So of course there were interactions in other ways, emails and phone calls and that sort of thing, but we did not take that into account, just the ones that we could see within the learning management system itself. And these courses were all designed by full-time faculty members, and then they had common elements across that were the same. So even though the instructors had an option to kind of make it their own in certain ways, they were required to complete the same assignments and to complete the same discussion questions and so on. So looking at these, then we had 12 instructors from 4 different courses, and they had varied background professionally and experience with teaching online. So most of these were limited term lecturers, 9 were, and then 3 were full-time faculty members. And when we did our analysis, the instructor was the unit of analysis that we used. So here in this table, you can see our pseudonyms and the various experience that the 12 selected cases that we looked at. And when we went to analyze the data that we collected, so you can imagine with 12 instructors, and we looked at everything that they observable online in these learning management systems. That was a lot of data to look at. So we started with pre-existing codes, both in social presence and teaching presence, and we took these indicators then and piloted them and coded some aspects of the course. We met multiple times and figured out which ones were working for our purposes, and then we expanded on these by deleting some codes and adding other ones that we felt were missing and collapsing some down in different ways. Then once we finished this process, our final indicator count was 43 codes, and then we coded at the sentence level, and we had over 12,000 references that we ended up coding. And here's a couple examples of of one social presence indicator and one teaching presence indicator. So you can see, for instance, self-disclosure was an example of social presence where an instructor might share something personal with the student, such as what he or she had done over the weekend in order to try to make that connection with students. Or an example of a teaching presence indicator would have been promoting collaboration with the students. So, encouraging the students to work in a specific way with their peers. So what we found was that instructors' involvement in the course were the highest in both the discussion and the announcements. This wasn't really surprising, as this is where most of the communication takes place. And while we decided not to look at an overall quantitative analysis to kind of compare codes, we did do some counts because we felt that this was a way to get a descriptive, kind of get an idea of what was going on with the different codes and how instructors were interacting with students in the course. So one interesting aspect was that many of the instructors, most in fact, were fairly balanced between their use of both the teaching presence indicators and the social presence. And most of them, though, did use more social presence indicators than the teaching presence. And we, looking at this list, this here on the table are the top 10 indicators that we observed, and 7 of these codes were actually fall into the social presence category as well. But it's interesting to think about how the different codes were used, because a closer look at the actual category shows that possibly differing weight should be used whenever we kind of consider these codes. So at the top of the list is emphasis. This is basically if an instructor goes through and highlights something or bolds a text, that can be done pretty easily. But compare that to clarifying something or explaining something in more detail, a teaching presence indicator, that takes a little bit more effort. So that's just something to keep in mind, that some are more easily applied and take less effort than others, but yet both are important in establishing that presence that the instructor is creating in an online course. And then looking at our second, where we created the profiles, we wanted to see how the various instructor actions and behaviors could come together, how basically were the social presence and the teaching presence indicators working together. And so what we started to do first was we looked at all the teaching presence indicators and we grouped these in different ways. Ones that kind of went together to form a specific role that instructors play in the online courses. And what we found was we saw 5 distinct roles, and these were advocating, facilitating, sense-making, organizing, and maintaining. And so it seemed really inaccurate to say that an instructor was only doing one of these roles in a course. So what we did instead was we looked at all of the teaching presence indicators that we observed in their course, and then used that to compare when it was broken down in each of these different roles, what percentage comprised that of their total teaching presence. So you can see across that this kind of shows a specific style for each instructor. Some really focused on 1 or 2 of these roles, where others were more balanced across all of them. And, you know, you can imagine if you had an instructor that was focused mainly on more of the administrative task or roles, that's really where his or her presence was coming through, then that's going to be a lot different than someone who's the majority of his or her efforts are focused on helping students make sense of course content or facilitating in different ways. But by considering these, then we could start to develop these profiles. And so then the social presence indicators, we really were looking at how these worked with the teaching presence indicators. And the number of social presence indicators observed for an instructor really served to enhance or enable what they were doing in the teaching presence roles that they were serving. But then this interaction, basically you can think of a message. So while a message might have been similar from one instructor to another, if one instructor is using emoticons and emphasis and different things, and that message is going to come across a lot differently than if someone just basically, only focuses on getting the message out there without the social presence indicators. So this graphic then looks at this spectrum. You know, if instructors have low social presence versus high, then you can kind of see, they might stick with greetings and acknowledgement at a low level, but then at a high level, there we get to some of the other things where they are encouraging cohesive and interactive behaviors. Back to Jen.
Back to me. Back to Indiana. All right, so I think we're probably doing the shortest version of these studies ever. But so the implications for this study, we found some really interesting things, because up until this point, for us anyway, it was all kind of anecdotal what the instructors were doing in the courses. So being able to have some kind of profile or picture where we could actually have some kind of visualization of what this looked like was really helpful to even think about, where do I fit in that kind of situation? But so some of the implications we have is that it helps us to understand these types of profiles and these findings, the role, regardless if the instructor is teaching a pre-designed course or a course, if they're a course designer instructors, what we had to call them throughout this to make sure we kept them straight. It also really made us realize, until we came up with those 5 categories, which we talk about in the article, all the different roles that we play. I mean, most of us have just always done it, right? We haven't sat back and said to ourselves, what are the roles I'm playing? Well, I know I'm maintaining. We're all maintaining all the time, right? And I know I'm facilitating, but am I an advocate? Well, an advocate is for advocating for student learning, those types of things. So, you feel a little better too. You're like, I'm doing all these things, okay. But, what is that balance? And I think that with those 12 instructor cases, we were really able to say, this is the what and how of the actions and behaviors that we can see in the live portion of a course. I think it would be really muddy if we started going into the pre-implementation phase, right, the design phase, because there could be so many people involved in that too. But we also realized that these 12 instructor cases and the indicators we came up with Some of them were already in the literature. Some of them were examples that we came across with new codes. It really provides a gateway to strategies of things that people who are looking to refresh how their online teaching strategies are going, or someone who's new to teaching online that might not even think about what the strategies are. They're just focused, on getting started and getting in there. And as Adrie mentioned, a lot of those indicators, not a lot, but a good number of them are simple things that can be easily implemented and not need to take a lot of, consideration as you write them up. So emphasizing when those weekly reminders, or, just greeting people by name. Some of these things we've known for a while, but then some of the other behaviors were things that we found that weren't in the literature already, that maybe we've been doing, we just didn't know we'd been doing for a while. And I think that with that chart, this one, and this one, we can kind of see, I think over here, what did we decide? I think it's between 45 and 55% of social presence and teaching presence versus the other group that is 55 versus 45% social and teaching presence. So if that doesn't make sense, we can do that again. But basically everybody was somewhere within that realm of a pretty good balance between social and teaching presence behaviors. What else? I think that it makes us better understand as researchers and online instructors just the number of intricacies that are involved in what our roles are and what that looks like. And I think that if we are bringing new people in to teach courses, to design courses, but to teach courses too, it's really helpful to better understand what it is that people will be doing in those courses or could be doing to make it better learning environment for students. So what we're going to do is take a pause there and see if anybody has any questions before we kind of go on to the next study, which fits right in with this one. That one's looking at what instructors perceive they're doing. Any questions? People hate when I put my glasses up like this. Apparently it looks like I have big ears or something. I don't know. Big horsey ears. No questions? All right.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
So do you have any specific examples that you can give for if we want to improve our instructional presence, instructor presence?
Yeah. I just had it up here. Hold on. Other pages over here. So a lot of the things that we did come up with, so we have this article and we can send you the link to. It's in a Rodel. And Appendix A is a coding schema, but what we did in there, because Peg Ertmer taught us well, what we did in there is, aside from the indicators and the definitions, we provided examples. Mm-hmm. We also indicated where these things come from. So I think some of the best ways to understand these better is to look at the examples, what other people posted. So, for example, humor. Humor doesn't always come across well, by the way, right? We know that. So one of the humor examples is, good morning, everyone. What a beautiful morning it is. You know why, of course? Because you have an assignment due tonight. So that was probably a little cruel, But I'm looking for one that's a newer one. Collaborative was one of the ones that we came up with in this study. So it talks about the instructor promoting collaboration, working together among the students. So an example would be, I encourage you to really collaborate with each other in the forums as well as your projects teams. This is about, your group contributions as well as your own, your help you're learning, your peers learning. And so the person's kind of explaining why it's important to be collaborative. And just acknowledging. So, and this isn't acknowledging them as an individual necessarily, but the contents of the message. So I see your submissions and I'm reviewing them right now. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, kind of thing. If people have questions, just kind of getting back to them. So there's a lot of things. One of the best ones, and I think I remember who this was too, was approval. And they have go team, and they have, little emoticons there kind of thing. So that doesn't take a lot of effort to put in there, but, it can be encouraging.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question too in the chat that says, how did we account for feedback on the assignments? Or was that part of the data not included?
feedback that we could see in the LMS. So if we had access to general feedback, yes, but that was something that I think actually in the next study we talked a little bit more, asking the instructors about what that looked like. As Adrie mentioned, you know, a limitation is that A, this is a single program that we're looking at, but B, when you're looking at the live courses, the problem is, you know, FERPA reasons, we don't have access to everything. We can't ask the 12 instructors to keep track of all their emails. So we might have IRB, but we can't go into people's emails unless the instructor provided them, which in some cases they did. But we couldn't get them from everybody. So there was some things that we couldn't. And sometimes if there was clarification for, say, feedback, that would be an email type of thing that we didn't have access to. But actually, we're going to talk about feedback more in the next one, too. Good.
Here's another question. Did any of your instructors award badges for accomplishments such as assignment completions? Do you feel this was an instructor presence thing? So this was prior to our badges.
Yeah, we didn't have badges yet when we started with this. So this was 2014 and 16. We've just started using badges 2 years ago in some of the courses, and then this past fall in our online master's program. So no badges yet. Anything else? Okay. All right, so we're going to look at the next one. I have to put my glasses back up. All right. Although that's really big font right there. But so this next one, what we were really interested, so we had this really big class is what happened, and we ended up collecting way too much data in this class. And so we ended up breaking it up into a couple of different aspects of the study, which turned into a couple of different smaller studies and publications. So this one looked at instructors' perceptions. Now these are the same instructors that were in the first study of instructor presence in online learning environments. So we're collecting this from them the same time we're looking at their courses, okay? So some of the things that we know from the literature is that how an instructor engages with their students can have implications for students' overall learning experience and their satisfaction. So once again, we're using a case study approach, and we are looking at 13 instructors because one of the people who created a course, but we didn't, it's a long story. There's another full-time faculty member in this group, but his course was also in the last one. But we wanted to ask him specifically, we wanted to have at least a couple of instructors that could talk to us about course design as well. So that's why we added him into this mix when we didn't necessarily look at, there was 2 co-designers in the previous one. So, okay. Makes sense to me, but if you have questions about that, we can get back to that. All right. So some of the things that we find in here, look at specifically communication strategies, strategies to connect to students, potential impact of these on student participation and learning. And I think we found some interesting things. So I'm going to turn this over. Let's see, we got research questions. Whoops. So we had a couple of research questions here, a couple more. How much importance do online instructors place on instructor presence? Now, you know, keeping in mind that these are our peers, and if we ask them, do you think it's important, there might be some, you know, leeway to saying yes because they, you know, they know us, but how do instructors perceive particular communication strategies for promoting their instructor presence? How do they perceive their instructor presence behaviors or strategies as helping them connect with students? And how do the non-designer instructors, of which there was 9 in this group, perceive the impact of pre-designed courses on their instructor presence?
Okay, so like Jennifer mentioned, this was another multiple case study approach, and we have an additional faculty member that was used in this, that was interviewed, that sounds better, that was interviewed in this study, but the previous 12 from the first study are the same, as this was a follow-up investigation. So we used semi-structured interviews this time, and we focused primarily on 3 different areas. First, we looked at the importance the instructors place on their presence. We also wanted to ask them about the specific actions and behaviors that they take to project their presence. And then finally, their perceptions of outcomes or effects of their presence. And we created a coding schema to make sense of the interviews. So first, before we started coding, we actually created individual cases for each one to kind of provide an overview of what was going on in that interview, and to get a glimpse at that overall instructor's perceptions. And this coding schema then focused on 3 areas, and or back up. We ended up it focused on the 3 areas that I mentioned on the previous slide, and then we ended up getting these into 5 different categories, and overall there were 24 codes that we used to analyze these. And then after all the interviews were coded, then we could make comparisons from one case to another. But the specific areas focused on, we asked them about questions about their experience basically with teaching online, and then the importance of instructor presence, as well as actions and behaviors that they took. And then we focused on how the course design, whether it was designed by them or someone else, affected how they were able to create their presence. And then some miscellaneous codes were in there too. So what we found was that, not surprisingly, like Jennifer mentioned, we were working with peers here. So everyone shared that definitely instructor presence was an important part. Some even said it was critical or one of the most important aspects of teaching in an online environment. And in some cases, they did feel that this presence was situational. So for instance, some expressed that while they thought it was important, they also shared that it might be important for some students more so than other students. So one instructor actually shared, from his perspective, when he was a student, that he didn't necessarily need to feel a connection with his instructors, but he felt that many students do want that. So he saw that it was important in that way. But overall, they really viewed their presence as a way to communicate that they cared, that they were interested, or to show that they had expertise in a specific area. So a byproduct of this then was kind of, okay, they felt like the students were seeing them as a real person, but ultimately that their goal was more focused on sharing with the students that they were truly interested in the learning process and the student success. What's interesting is that initially only 4 instructors mentioned behaviors tied to teaching presence, such as course organization or giving students specific direction, that sort of thing, as being part of this presence that they create. Most only focused on the social aspects. So when they were describing their instructor presence, they were essentially just describing social presence and not totally accounting for how it was much bigger than just the social aspects. And on the next slide, we have a specific example from one instructor's perspective about the importance. So I will let everyone read it themselves, I guess. I don't know what the best practice is here. But basically,
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I was trying to move the pictures out of the way, but I don't know if I can.
The instructor is just sharing, that it's important, and it helps the students see that that she was more than just a grader that gives feedback. It's that human element, basically.
Okay.
So looking at our second research question, how instructors perceive particular communication strategies, as promoting their instructor presence. They saw this happening in 4 main ways. First, they felt like that it could help them set a specific tone that they wanted to in their course. So a friendly tone. They also shared it was important to communicate promptly, select communication methods that match the needs of the individual students, and to model acceptable online strategies. So they realized that for the students, a lot of them are learning online for the first time, and so it was important for them to model what they expected of their students. At the same time, they considered the specific affordances of the online environment as they selected techniques. One instructor shared, she tried to think about how it was to have a face-to-face conversation. So what does that look like face-to-face, and how could she translate that into an online? She mentioned, in a face-to-face, I use their names, I smile a lot. So even though it might seem silly to use the emoticons and to do different things in the online setting, it still can be conversational and to promote that. Finally, sharing was another way that they felt like they communicated this. This was done in their personal biographies with the introductions of the course. But then some instructors went beyond that. So we kind of saw 2 groups emerge about how they shared information. On one hand, you had instructors who shared enough to express their expertise. And then on the other hand, you had a group that shared, that showed a balance between both personal and professional information. So in the first case, they didn't necessarily share anything personal beyond professional experiences. In the second case, these individuals worked to find a balance. So they felt they could share personal stories as a way to connect with the students. One instructor shared with his students, for instance, that he remembered being in graduate school and struggling with an assignment. So he wanted his students to understand that it was okay if they didn't have all the answers, and that, that it's challenging, but he was encouraging at the same time. Finally, feedback was another communication strategy. So this kind of goes back to the question that we received at the end of the first study. But they felt that this was something a little bit unexpected for us, because they really viewed this as a communication strategy in a way to share their presence or to create their presence. And this was done in several ways. Formal assignments. So a lot of the instructors used track changes in Microsoft Word to provide feedback. So they felt this was one way they could show their presence. They also provided positive remarks with the weaknesses that they felt that students could, areas that they could improve on. So they felt that it was important to use gentle language, not to ever come across that they were scolding the students. So they were very careful in how they gave this feedback to make sure that it achieved its purpose without coming across too critical. So feedback through the discussions as well. And here are some examples of that through modeling, redirecting ideas. So it was an area that they commonly discussed. And so I'll give you a minute to look at these. Of course, in our full paper, these examples are also shared as well. So you can, if you're interested in looking at them more closely, that's an option.
Yeah, we really hadn't expected that grading and assessment and feedback would be a communication strategy. So
right,
it makes absolute sense after, we thought about it. It's very practical, but still surprised us. All right.
So on to research question 3. So whenever we looked at how they perceived their presence behaviors in terms of strategies to help them connect with students, they felt that their efforts were more important to some students than others. I gave one example of this a few slides back, but another example is that one instructor shared that she felt that her instructor presence efforts were really impactful for students she viewed at risk. She was maybe worried that if a student had stopped participating as frequently, that she felt her presence could help get that student back on track, for instance. And they seem kind of uncertain about the specific impact of their presence on learning. So what that relationship was specifically, they weren't sure, but they were hopeful that it did have a positive impact on the learning process. And some shared that maybe it was more in an indirect way, such as a motivational factor, and that their actions and behaviors maybe influenced how students interacted and participated. So if the instructor interacted or participated more, then they felt like this led to stronger interaction and participation from their students. Overall, they felt that their presence did impact the overall online learning environment in the way that they chose to communicate, share, and interact. And overall, it helped them to create a specific type of learning environment. So how they chose to create their presence directly impacted how the environment was that the students were participating, or how it was being perceived by the students, rather. And I think on the next slide, we have some examples of these type. So the motivation that I referred to, and then being encouraging to help create a harmonious environment among the students.
I'm terrible about knowing how long to wait, so.
Me too.
All right.
And then our final research questions, when we were looking at how this phenomenon of having courses that are designed by one instructor but taught by someone else, how is this impacting instructor presence? And what we found was that all but one of the instructors that were teaching courses that weren't designed by them felt that they did not, that did not impact their presence. But then they continued on to say that it was restricting in some way or frustrating. So while they said, no, I don't think it impacts our presence, then they went on to say, well, I don't know, it's kind of frustrating. So maybe they hadn't totally, thought through how they felt about that, that situation. But what's interesting is that when we talked to the course designers, only one shared that she designed her course with instructor presence in mind. Most of them shared that they did not create or design with the idea that someone else would be teaching this and need to create their own instructor presence. But they said, even though we did not necessarily have that in mind, we still feel that there's a lot of room for an individual to teach this course and create a unique presence. And I think the quotes are on this specific slide this time, so maybe you've already had a chance to look at those, but I think
and the courses for this program, right, that we're researching, which happens to be LDT Learning Design Tech, we do not allow for changing of the content. So you can add resources, you can do some things like that, but the content has to be the same because the outcomes have to be the same. Whereas I know some other programs here on this campus, they give you the outcomes and then you can design whatever you want. But we didn't want to have that. We didn't want to take that chance in our courses, I think, so.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the implications from this particular study is, I found it interesting initially that when we talk to the instructors, and they understand the difference between social presence behaviors and teaching presence behaviors, but they didn't understand that teaching presence also has a way of helping them present their persona as an instructor. So that was something that they kind of came to the realization as we talked more about, well, yeah, but this all goes together. It's not just the, hi, how are you? And then you get down to business and that's something different. This is all how you are being perceived as an instructor. As Adrie mentioned, all of the instructors did indicate that they thought instructor presence was important to the success of the course and for the students. They also thought that the study was underscoring the importance of the role that instructor presence plays in connecting with students through being approachable, showing them concern for their success, demonstrating expertise. And we had that one instructor who did not need it himself, but understood the importance that instructor presence really is important for the students to feel connected, to be doing well in that course. That did not come out right. I'm a little foggy today. What can I say? Anyway, okay. We talked about the use of particular communication strategies, things like setting the tone, modeling expected behaviors. And, you know, modeling expected behaviors was something that took me a long time to figure out how to do that. And then I realized I had to explicitly state, I am modeling behaviors. And that seemed to help, right? I thought maybe if I just modeled, it would be picked up. But, yeah. So sometimes we have to be a little bit more blatant about it. So. But the sharing of personal information, you know, we had people, as Adrie mentioned, that said, you know, talked about, well, you know, when I was doing consulting for Intel and I was designing training, we went about it this way, and they would present a story that tied into the assignment. Whereas others would be, you know, not sharing too much personal information, but, oh my God, it was a great weekend. We went skiing in Michigan this weekend, and family had a great time, you know, and then going on to some other things that might be more content related. And not all students necessarily care about that, but we know that's something that most of them felt was very important. So, and then as I mentioned, and Adrie mentioned, the use of feedback as a communication strategy. It's just something that's never really put into that category, but the instructors felt that that was a large portion of the communication they had between them and individual students. So other things such as providing overall feedback too, in discussion posts, forums, announcements, things like that were things that they also saw as and viewed as communication strategies. So the discussion overall for instructor presence is, first, we still have more data, just saying. We have all the student data still. we got a little burnt out on it for, you know, a little while there though. Adrie brings it up every once in a while. So we know that instructor presence is a result of many different types of actions and behaviors. We also know from our findings from these studies is that instructors should be mindful of the type of presence that they are creating. Be intentional with their efforts. Be aware of what it is that they're putting out there and how that impacts that persona that they're putting off. We know that for instructors teaching pre-designed courses, they still have some opportunities to create unique presence. A lot of it might be through communication, facilitation, reaching out to the students, sharing some of their own personal background. But at the same time, we do need to have design options that are considered as ways to maximize the opportunities for them to create their own presence. What does that look like? Not exactly sure. What we came away with from the data was that being more flexible with some aspects of the course, maybe having some input, and we've been doing this for a while, but I don't think it crosses that line entirely, where the LTLs or the adjuncts have the ability to say, you know, I'd like to put this into my course, you know, this is my blog, and I'd like to make this a major point of sharing content and things like that. We've got one person who does that. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but we don't have the answer for that coming out of these studies. We just know it's something we need to do. And also going back to the first study is really taking a look at instructor presence in our courses so that you know, if we can look at those behaviors, if we can look to things like the gateway strategies we have in Appendix A that might help new instructors if they can see how other people are behaving in classes, giving new instructors access to your own courses if you're comfortable with that. But at the same time, maybe reviewing our own personal instructor presence style. So sometimes I go through a course. I know this happens to me all the time, and I hardly have a chance to look back. I am just moving forward the best I can because I got 10 other things going on. You have 10 other things going on. So I hardly have a chance to go back and look at my behaviors. Maybe going back and looking at those profiles and some of those descriptions and where do I fit? Am I good with that? Because we all know in the end that reflection is really a key part of being an excellent teacher. So that's something to consider. So one more slide. So conclusions, we had a couple of overall conclusions, some implications for design. We're not gonna, because we just did these both together, we're not gonna go into this in much more detail. Making room for the non-designer instructors to have a place in the courses. Conceptually, the context of the non-designer instructors presents another opportunity for us to look at the COI model, because the COI model doesn't really take into account that it doesn't not take into account that there might be multiple people involved in the process. It's not something that we generally consider. Most of our research studies with COI tend to indicate, if they don't specifically state, that people created these courses and then we did research on them. So I'm guessing there's a lot more out there that really are somebody created this course and somebody else taught it. And we're seeing more of that in the last couple of years. The idea of instructor presence, the concept of it provides a way for practitioners and researchers to talk about the roles of the non-designer instructor. And as Garrison and Arbog contend, the nature of the relationships between the elements, the three elements, social, teaching, and cognitive presence has been established. There's still much to be learned about context, including disciplines, which Jean was in here, and she's looking at disciplines now. Course delivery, characteristics of the learners. A lot of our studies for the COI look at one particular group, undergraduates, graduates, somebody in business, somebody in education. So maybe those different contexts have different things that emerge that are best practices or evidence-based practices. And I already mentioned the limitations. Single program that we're looking at, it's a graduate level master's program. Might not be as applicable to undergraduates or programs in other locations and contexts. So what kind of questions might you guys have, or what can we help with, or do you have input for us? I guess I should put that one up.
Here's a question. Can you give some examples of how you found instructors created presence in pre-designed courses?
Yes, so we had, like we said, we had 9 of those people from the 13 in that second study were the non-designer instructors, which really becomes a mouthful after a while. And most of them talked about it really being in the use of the communication strategy. So it's not that they're necessarily changing any aspect of the course, but it's how they're communicating with the students.
Right. So some might share personal stories. Again, that was a common way that they did that. They would share what they did over the weekend or professional experiences, or in the feedback. Again, that was a way that we were surprised, but even in the discussion, they would ask them questions to help them think about it more fully, or the way that they provided feedback were other ways.
Yeah, I don't think that the non-designer instructors had different ways than the designer instructors for creating that type of instructor presence, so much as they might have used it more because they were coming into something that was already built.
Here is, thank you, fascinating topic. How can we access the papers? Are they published?
Yeah, actually they are both published, except for the data we haven't analyzed yet. They're both in a Rodal, and I can add it onto the slides. So one is June 2015, and a Rodal is the International Review of Research and Open and Distributed Learning. I think it's irrodl.org, and it's a open access journal. One is June 2015, and the other one is, I got it here somewhere.
I have it too.
June 2016. And we can send the links for that too, or we can add them onto the slides if that helps. Anything else?
I have a question. So if you had to extend, are you considering extending this research? Are you looking at any other aspects of instructor presence?
I think that the students' perceptions of instructor presence would be the logical place to go to see, you do this research sometimes and you're like, do the students even care?
Mm-hmm.
We know they care from other research studies, but why do they care? And, how do they interpret those behaviors, I think, is something that could be really useful to look at. Maybe we're spending a lot of time and effort as instructors thinking we're doing a good thing, and they don't care about those behaviors that we're spending time on so much as these behaviors that don't take as much time. So I think that students' perceptions, instead of the ones that we're ultimately trying to do well by, would probably be.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see, that you had both instructors who are designers and those who are not. I think even seeing that, I think if students can see a difference between those two types of classes, a difference too.
Well, one of the big faux pas I've seen, or maybe it's just something that drives me nuts, but is if I have an instructor in one of my courses, I'm not teaching it, but I'm course lead for it, and if they don't understand something in the course, instead of going with it as if it's their course, they're like, I don't know, I didn't design that.
Oh.
And you're like, well, that didn't help you and it didn't help me, but
So does that model exist at Purdue? Like, do they give the instructors packaged courses?
Yep.
Oh.
Well, not packaged. I mean, like, I develop my courses.
Okay, like
Adrie
that.
develops her courses. Every time they're offered, we update them and everything. Then there's a course master, and we copy it out. And then Adrie Adrie actually will have a large course in the fall, but I don't have any of the courses that have 12 sections. I'm usually doing some of the electives, so I'll have 2, 3, 4, 5 sections of a course.
Oh.
Mine are much smaller. I don't even think most of them have that many, but.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's because you have a lot of students and so you have to offer multiple sections.
Too many students.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Excellent. We are almost at time, 2:57. Let's see if anybody else has any other pressing questions.
I think we went longer than we thought we would.
Yeah.
It always happens.
And you had 2 studies in there, so it was very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you both for taking the time to talk to us today. So as I said, we're recording it so that, a lot more folks can watch the recording.
Okay.
From it too.
Sounds good. Thanks,
you.
Florence.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Each morning I look over to find you.